Well, thanks everyone for joining another conversation with Incubate as part of our Incubate Policy Lab, our Inflation Reduction Act working group. We're continuing to try to bring the latest and greatest information about how the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act and its drug pricing provisions are having impacts. You can also follow along where we're seeing real-time changes in Incubate's investment tracker available at incubatecoalition.org. Continuing with our conversations with thought leaders, we once again are lucky to be joined by Kirsten Axelsen, who is a policy advisor at DLA Piper. This after a pretty stellar career in biopharma over the last several decades. She's a regular on Incubate's Making Medicine podcast, as well as has participated in the drafting of reports for Incubate Policy Lab. She is also a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, in Washington. Kirsten, I think I'll skip over the rest of your impressive bio. I think everyone knows that you're a thought leader on what's going on in the biopharma community, and really looking forward to our second conversation where we're going to dig a little deeper on the impacts and implications for the Inflation Reduction Act. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over. I'll be chiming in and encouraging Kirsten to dig a little deeper on a few places, and then we'll close out. But thanks to everyone from policymakers to those in industry to those in patient advocacy groups for joining us to hear about this important conversation. Kirsten, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having me here today. And what I will do is take us through some of the ways the Inflation Reduction Act will have a differential impact on small molecules relative to large molecules. So the Inflation Reduction Act will not only affect the different types of medicines based on the price setting provisions in the law, but also there will be other effects in particular related to the redesign of the Medicare Part D benefit. So in the next few minutes, I'll take us through some of the sort of more obvious first order effects of the law, and also consider some of the indirect effects of the law, including on the development of evidence and the likely implications for formulary utilization management and net pricing. Of course, formulary utilization management and net pricing directly affect what a patient pays to get access to their medicines. The Inflation Reduction Act is differentially punitive to small molecule medicines for the elderly and the disabled. It will reduce the reward from investing to a more significant degree relative to other types of drug assets. And when I say other types of drug assets, I mean small molecules that aren't used for the elderly and disabled to the same degree, and large molecules in Medicare, and of course, large molecules that are not used to the same degree with the elderly and disabled, who typically get their insurance, their drug coverage and their insurance coverage through Medicare. There are a few key ways in which the Act will differentially impact small molecules relative to large molecules. First of all, the maximum fair price provision, the provision that will allow the federal government to set the price for drugs that have been on the market for a certain number of years, takes effect earlier for small molecules relative to large molecules. The scope and timing of the selection of drugs that will have a maximum fair price reduces revenues sooner and will affect more small molecules, in part because there's just more small molecules out there today. Risk shifting in Medicare Part D, which will reduce the federal subsidy for higher cost beneficiaries, increases discount obligations, and will for small molecule manufacturers primarily, and will also result in more utilization management, quite likely, of formularies in Medicare Part D, which is principally small molecules. Faced with the lower value of expected revenue, investors may consider other opportunities that are not so heavily weighted towards small molecules for the elderly and disabled who receive their coverage through Medicare. And importantly, small molecule drugs and their biodynamics are needed to treat disease and conditions prevalent in the elderly. We can't simply move investment to a world where there will be more just large molecules used, although there have been an increasing number of breakthrough medicines with large molecule technology. Small molecule technology is still critical to treating patients, particularly in diseases such as cancer.
And I know we're going to pull this apart, but can you talk about, we're talking about large molecules. Is it fair to say that's the same as biologics and biosimilars? I know there are a lot of terms that are getting thrown around.
A large molecule, biologics and biosimilars are large molecules. Large molecules are made from complex live materials. They're typically injectable or physician administered, so either through an infusion or self-administered. They are more complex to manufacture. Large molecules are 100% unable to cross the blood-brain barrier, so they are less bioavailable in that way. Small molecules, by contrast, are more able to cross the blood-brain barrier, but still about 95% able to cross the blood-brain barrier. So that is, and again, that is critical to things such as cancer and certain neurological conditions. When we think about the end of patent life or the end of exclusivity, that's where a lot of the savings occurs and a lot of really tremendous value occurs to the health system when a drug has been in use for a certain number of years and goes off patent. Almost 100% of small molecules face generic competition. And generics are dispensed 97% of the time when they are available in small molecules. So if you look at therapeutic categories such as statins, other cardiovascular disease treatments, they are largely generic, and we're seeing many of the same cardiovascular health benefits with a much lower cost. By contrast, for large molecules and biologics, when they lose exclusivity of right to market that drug alone, a biosimilar will enter the market. Typically, biosimilars do not enter the market as quickly, and the uptake has been slower, although that market is still developing. However, large molecules are more costly and take a longer time to develop, and typically are higher cost to manufacture. So small molecules easier to develop from a manufacturing and often from a testing capacity. And then large molecules tend to be a bit more costly and time consuming to take through the clinical development process to drug approval.
And we've seen a lot of effort, to be sure, over the last decade in Alzheimer's, this multi-trillion-dollar sword hanging over an aging population in the US and around the globe. And we've seen some very expensive failures. We've seen some drugs get approvals. When you talk about that blood-brain barrier, just want to make sure I'm getting this right. Small molecules, small enough that they can find their way into tackling diseases of the brain, but these large molecules, these biologics, cannot. That's right?
Yes, and there are large molecules that are used in neurological conditions, but it's when they're different technologies and used for, you need both, basically. You need both to be able to, depending on what you're targeting in the therapeutic process. So we don't want a world where there's no incentives to develop large molecules, and we don't want a world where there's less incentives to develop small molecules. And in fact, I think a major concern with the Inflation Reduction Act is it distorts the incentive to develop a small molecule relative to a large molecule, whereas really you want the incentive to develop these medicines to be largely based on unmet need and science, whereas now it's a bit more skewed because of this somewhat arbitrary distinction in the law that sets the price sooner for the small molecules relative to the large molecules. And when we think of a small molecule, it's typically a pill, the kind of drug you would pick up from the pharmacy and take yourself.
Yeah, I like our graphics here that you've put forward. We got the pills, and then we've got sort of the infusion therapies that would be at a hospital or a clinic. One interesting piece I picked up from some folks working on cutting edge is that cell and gene therapies, sort of the next generation, some of them do go through the same regulatory pathway as small molecule. And so not only should we be thinking of small molecule as the pills in our medicine cabinet, but also the most cutting edge cell and gene therapies also sometimes. Is that right?
I'm familiar with cell and gene therapies that are more sort of plasma and blood derived, but that is likely correct if that's information you're hearing from a manufacturer. I do know that there are a number of small molecule medicines that are targeted cancer therapeutics. There has been increasing development in this area, in part because I think there's interest in creating therapeutics that were easier for a patient to take, right? I think most people would rather take a pill than have to either self-inject or administer in the physician's office. And I'm not saying that's going to go away entirely, but again, if you're thinking about the expected returns to investing in a new technology, the small technology investment has been reduced to a greater degree than the large molecule technology investment, and that will affect where investors and companies place their bets on the next generation of medicines. And so, when an investor is considering where they may place their bets, prior to the IRA, they had the choice of small molecules for diseases of the elderly and the disabled, large molecules for that population, and small molecules. And so, again, now the small molecule investment may still be an attractive one, but it is less so to a greater degree now than it was before the IRA relative to other types of therapeutics. Well, first I'm going to focus on the price setting provision of the IRA, which mandates that the federal government through CMS set a maximum fair price for a select number of drugs that have the biggest revenue in the Medicare program. And this will start with the Medicare Part D program, which is, again, the drugs you pick up at a pharmacy. That's going to be almost entirely small molecules. And then over time, both the number of drugs expand, and then the price setting will start to go into Part B, which are the physician-administered drugs, more large molecules, starting in 2028. So this provision will affect the small molecules sooner. Not only will it affect them sooner, when the price is set, it will be set after 9 years on the market for small molecules, and it'll be set after 13 years in the market for large molecules. There are also different price ceilings for Part B, which are mostly large molecule drugs, compared to Part D, which are mostly small molecule drugs. And in just a few moments, I'll take you through the expected magnitude of the reduction in price based on a calculation of the anticipated price ceilings. And then over time, the prices will be further declined after 11 years and after 12 and 16 years on the market, the prices continue to come down. CMS has already released information on the timeline for this process, has been seeking input primarily on how the information is collected. We will know around the third quarter of this year when the 10 negotiation eligible drugs are going to be selected from Part D. I'm sorry, that's the fourth quarter of this year. The manufacturers will be asked to sign agreements and submit data about their product, including the rebates, expenses from R&D, comparative value assessments. And then we will know in September 2024 which drugs will have the prices set, as well as those prices. And those prices will be going into effect in 2026. But I think importantly, even though the price reductions don't go into effect until 2026, the decline in anticipated revenue will be known. They'll be indicated by the end of this year. It'll be known by 2024, which will affect decisions in later stage development, follow-on indications for those small molecules which are selected from Part D for price setting.
To maybe say that bit another way to see, a lot of times Incubate talks about the relay race. A lot of the education we've done with policymakers and stakeholders is the different roads or different points along the way and different actors. There's a role for NIH and academia. They do very basic research, but they don't actually make drugs. A small biotech and venture capital get the wheels rolling. And then there's an acquisition, usually by a large manufacturer who's the brand names we all know, who can guide it through the end of the regulatory process and through the very intense manufacturing standards that we feel comfortable achieving safety and efficacy. Is it a way to your point at the end was interesting, that we'll have an indication about the decline in revenues so if we think about that relay race in reverse, this person at the end chain is going to know fairly soon we're far less profitable than we thought we're going to be. So they may be buying less here, which means less funding earlier, which means less commercialization and development of some innovation that happens in a lab somewhere. Is that kind of how it could play out in reverse?
Yes, I believe so. There will be, less reward for investing in later stage studies and for the drugs that you are likely to be price controlled. Those later stage studies are often on special populations that weren't included in the pivotal clinical trials, such as veterans, such as people with comorbidities, new pediatric studies. It would be, imagine if you learned that your house was going to be seized under eminent domain and the government was going to give you a certain price for it. You would stop painting and repairing windows, right? Because it's like, well, I'm going to get the price that I'm going to get. And so it's, once you know that the value of an asset is capped and declining, you can be much less likely to invest in further indications for that asset. And we've seen in therapeutic areas such as HIV, such as anti-infectives, that there can be development, well after they have been on the market for a significant amount of time, that expands the indications and expands the use of that drug.
I love that analogy that you just used. And to take it one step further, is you're a thought leader leading particularly on clinical trial diversity, what can be done to make US-based clinical trials and global clinical trials more inclusive. Is it fair to say that, totally separate from the Inflation Reduction Act, some of the supporters of these pricing provisions also want to see the house painted and the windows done? I mean, there's also an effort to increase the requirements in what could be a very positive way to make clinical trials. But in your analogy of eminent domain in the house, not only are they taking my house and telling me what they're going to pay for it, but they also want me to fix the windows and paint. Is that fair?
I think it's fair to a degree. I mean, many of the guidance and now the requirements to implement a diversity plan in clinical studies are for the pre-approval, so the pivotal clinical trials. But the Inflation Reduction Act is likely to affect clinical development in two ways. For these drugs that are already on the market, that are going to be the first to experience price controls, is likely to affect the later stage development. The cost has already been sunk to bring these drugs to the market. For the drugs that are, being considered right now, you could see this it will have an effect in a number of ways, and we've already heard this from companies. They're considering pursuing only one indication, for example. And again, if they think they are likely to be price controlled, they will be less likely to do follow-on studies, follow-on indications. And insofar as they don't include certain populations in their pivotal clinical studies, some of those follow-on studies may not get done, which may or may not have been focused on, elderly people with comorbid conditions and the like, who are not included in some of the early studies. When we consider what drugs are likely to be affected, both in the Part D price setting, which is mostly small molecules, and the Part B price setting, which is mostly large molecules, oncology drugs for cancer are among the likely top targets, followed by immunology and endocrine disorders, cardiovascular disease. Basically, by deciding to pick the largest drugs, CMS and the way the Inflation Reduction Act is designed is saying, pick the drugs that are most used and set those prices, which is a great way to save money. It's a terrible way to motivate investment in chronic disease, or other drugs that are used by a lot of people. It is a great way to motivate investment in small niche markets and orphan diseases. So, in addition to this act differentially reducing revenue from small molecules, it's also creating an incentive to really invest in more smaller disease, smaller indications, which may be good for patients and may be good to science, but typically does yield higher cost specialized medicines. So now let's consider the impact of this price ceiling. The current Part D price on average after rebates is around 53% of the list or sticker price. Based on sort of the formula and the law, the ceiling price for drugs that are first price controlled, so that's 9 years on the market, small molecules, will be 51% of the list price. So you might say, well, that's not so bad relative to the average discounted price in Medicare Part D. And for some drugs, it may end up being relatively close to the average discounted price in Part D. But there's a couple other effects to consider. First of all, that is the ceiling. There is no reason to not bring the price down below that ceiling. When a drug is deeply discounted in Medicare, that becomes the new ceiling. So if a company is already offering discounts below what the price ceiling would be that is set in the law, that will become their new price ceiling, and CMS could set a price below that. In addition to that, plans may still want rebates for formulary placement, so that will drive the price down further. Or a company may say, it is no longer makes sense for me to further discount to get that preferred formulary position. I'll take the lower formulary position and the revenue from this drug that I can get, but I can't discount below what the government is setting as my maximum price. So paradoxically, we could see drugs that have price setting going on a lower formulary tier with drugs that have free pricing, discounting deeply, and ending up being on a more affordable formulary tier. And then considering this price setting for the large molecules, and this is an illustration for the price reduction that is expected in Part B, that is a relatively less steep decline relative to the current ASP, and 67% of the current ASP for the Part B drugs. But again, a significant price cut relative to the current price. Considering this illustration, small molecule now typically is on the market for about 14 years and then sees a really significant decline in revenue because generics move in and are dispensed at 97% of the time that they are available. Typically, the small molecule list price stays at the same level or goes up when there is a generic. And again, most of that revenue is moved over to the generic. In the large molecule space, that decline when there is a biosimilar entrant has not been as significant, as that market is still developing or may continue to just be not as significant. In the post-Inflation Reduction Act world, that decline in revenue is going to happen sooner for the small molecule that is selected for Part D price setting. It will happen after 9 years, and the larger molecule will still experience a decline in expected revenue, but it will not be as significant or as soon as it would be for the small molecule.
I want to stay on this chart for a second, if it's okay, because one, I think it's one of the first times I've seen it model out, but I think there's some really important things to call out. The first is that right now, from the investor's perspective, we see about 14 years as what we've gotten, and what we've gotten seems to work really well. So, 13 years for biologic, that stings a little bit, to be sure, maybe more than just a little bit. But that delta from 14 to 9, another study that I just came across showed from Jeffries, showed for small molecule drugs, 50% of the revenue occurs in years 9 to 13. And as I look at your graph, as I think about what would I invest in, I know the pre-IRA stuff is no longer available to me, but I think one of the key points of this session is nobody wants to invest in the dotted yellow line where it's collapsing that early. So I commend you on putting this slide together, because it almost shows what an investor could think would yield the best return. And that dotted yellow line looks pretty damning. So I just want to thank you on pulling that together and call out that pre-IRA, we're used to this idea of about 14 years between exclusivity and patents, which I know we'll talk about in a future session. So thanks. This is just great to see.
Now, the peak sales years are often right towards the end of patent life. There can be some degradation in those years because there's competitors that enter the market, but often, this is again modeled to show what maybe $1 billion peak sales might look like. Cutting the small molecules off at 9 years is far more distorting relative to what is occurring in the large molecules. If the intent of this law was to eliminate drugs that never experience a generic competitor, they just keep adding on to their patents or whatever is the perception by policymakers, then the thing to do would have been to either introduce competition or cut the price after 13 or 14 years. Clearly, by reducing the price of the small molecules earlier, that's not mimicking sort of natural erosion of the market when a generic enters. It is cutting that off far sooner than would be anticipated. So now shifting to another major provision of the law, which is the redesign of the Medicare Part D benefit, which will shift more of the cost for people who use higher cost medicines to health plans and to biopharma companies, and reduce the federal subsidy. So I'm sure many of you have seen a chart similar to this, how the old benefit looked and the new benefit looks. They're both complicated, but less complicated now. There is no more coverage gap. And importantly for this discussion, people who reach that high level of spending, typically over $8,000 of out-of-pocket spending today, of true out-of-pocket spending today. And those are people who are typically taking drugs for immunologic conditions, cancer. They are now the federal government is subsidizing that population by 80% in the Medicare Part D benefit. That was implemented to keep plans from designing formularies that discriminated against people who were very sick or used very expensive medicines. Over time, as those expensive medicines, especially drugs, have become a larger and larger proportion of just the therapeutic portfolio and the Medicare Part D benefit, the government's liability for that subsidy has grown. And so logically, the government decided to reduce their liability for that population. However, in doing so, that also puts a lot more risk on the Part D plan, and also puts more of a discounting obligation on the biopharma manufacturer. So I think something we could potentially anticipate is more utilization management of those types of drugs in the future. And that doesn't just mean copays and cost sharing, because there will be an out-of-pocket cap, but that could mean step edits or prior authorizations or other hurdles to use. Again, this is the Part D benefit, so those are mostly small molecules. So we're going to see, continued impact on the small molecules, more restrictive formulary designs anticipated for small molecule specialty drugs, and then this bigger discounting obligation on the biopharma manufacturer, who is now responsible for 20% of the cost in the catastrophic coverage zone. And so just kind of to wrap up the points that we started with, I think we can anticipate less expected revenue from small molecules that are focused on diseases of the elderly and disabled. We will anticipate that this will affect investment both in drugs that are in the pre-launch phase, as well as those that are on the market, and also can anticipate greater formulary management, particularly for specialty drugs that are small molecules in Medicare Part D.
Kirsten, thank you so much. We covered a lot of ground there, and I want to come back to one of the pieces you closed with, because there is now not enough discussion, but there's growing awareness in Congress, I feel like, that the 9 years for small molecule may have been an error. And when I've talked to some folks who are a part of writing the law, well, they point to exclusivity going from 5 years to 9 years, and they say, well, we increased exclusivity. It's not a bad thing. We won't see less investment. And we're trying to talk, well, from the investor perspective, we see the combination of patent and exclusivity is 14 years, something I know we'll talk about another day. But what you closed with is something I don't think we're talking about as much, that would further disincentivize small molecule. And that's all of these cost-sharing mechanisms with Part D redesign will primarily hit small molecule. So would you say it's sort of a double whammy? Not only do they get this less protection, but as you sort of originally pointed out, that I don't think many others have, the Part D redesign can also potentially be a disincentive if your product's going to end up in Part D. Is that a fair summation of the two impacts?
Yes, it's a further reduction in revenue. Now, the good thing for both patients and for expected revenue and expected returns from investment in small molecules, that there is an out-of-pocket cap in Part D now. So that should help patients who had non-adherence due to affordability. However, again, with that combination of the less subsidy in the catastrophic coverage zone and the out-of-pocket cap, we can anticipate that health plans are going to become more restrictive in other ways for those higher cost drugs to avoid taking on that liability. So yeah, it is a double effect on small molecule drugs, in particular specialty drugs.
Yeah, and Incubate has definitely, we're excited to see those out-of-pocket caps come into place. There were several elements of the law that we fought strongly in support of, patient smoothing, so you don't get hit with a large expense right when your plan year starts, usually in January. We want to see out-of-pocket caps get, capped much more broadly so that insurance can really operate as insurance. But I'm so grateful for the education and awareness. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't spin a little advocacy into it. So I'll stress these are the views of Incubate, not necessarily Kirsten or DLA Piper, but Incubate will be leading the charge to amend the Inflation Reduction Act based on findings like this to increase that small molecule protection timeline from 9 years up to 13 years, so it can have parity with large molecules, and we let science, not Washington, dictate where capital flows and investments are made. So with that, you can count on hearing more about this from the Incubate Coalition to our policymaker audience. We're always happy to provide more resources, particularly on the therapeutic areas damaged most by this small molecule penalty. And as always, I am tremendously grateful to a good friend to Incubate and personally, Kirsten Axelsen with DLA Piper. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, John.